Get off the tools, you cook! Marco's voice boomed over the engine's roar, his face twisted in a cruel grin. He stood over me, his shadow swallowing the little light in the hot, greasy engine room of the Cajun Queen. Behind him, two deckhands snickered, their mockery echoing off the steel walls. To them, I was just the man who handled spices, not wrenches. My hands were for chopping onions, not for the real work of the sea. I felt a familiar, hot shame rise in my chest as I put the wrench down, his superiority absolute in that moment. That insult was meant to put me in my place. 3 days later, 80 miles from shore, the engine died, and the ocean went silent, leaving us adrift in a terrifying stillness. But nobody imagined what I would do that day. If this sentence reminded you of someone, just comment with, "I understand." My name is David. I'm 44 years old, though most days the salt and the sun make me feel 100. My world is a floating steel box called the Cajun Queen, adrift in the vast indifferent blue of the Gulf of Mexico. I'm the cook. It's a title that's supposed to define what I do, but out here, it defines what I am. And what I am, in the eyes of the crew, is less. My hands are clean, my voice is quiet, and my place is in the galley, surrounded by the smell of onions and old grease, far from the real work of men. The sea was my father's life. He wasn't a fisherman. He was an engine man, a greasy magician who could read the soul of a diesel engine through the soles of his boots. His knuckles were permanently stained with a blackness that never washed away, a badge of honor I never earned. I grew up in the deafening hum of engine rooms, the scent of diesel my first memory, but I chose a different path, a quieter one, a choice he never quite forgave me for. And now, out here, it's a choice that earns me nothing but scorn. The contempt comes mostly from Marco, the first mate. He's younger than me, built like a piling, with a voice that carries over the roar of the winch. He earned his position by being the loudest and the meanest, and he sees the world as a simple ladder. He's on a higher rung, and I'm somewhere down in the bilge water. To him, my quiet nature isn't a personality trait, it's a weakness, a flaw. He makes sure I'm reminded of it every single day. It's not always with a direct insult. Sometimes it's the way he'll hold his plate out for me to fill without making eye contact, as if I'm just a part of the galley equipment. Or the way he'll tell a joke to the table, loud enough for me to hear, about men who'd rather hold a whisk than a wrench. The other men, most of them kids trying to prove their own toughness, they just follow his lead. They laugh when he laughs. They look through me when he looks through me. It's a lonely existence, being the ghost at the feast you've just cooked. A few weeks ago, the humiliation was more direct. We were unloading a haul of shrimp at the dock in Port Fourchon. It was a grueling, sun-baked afternoon. I was helping carry ice, my back screaming in protest, when I slipped on a wet patch of deck. I didn't fall, but I stumbled, sending a few shovels of ice scattering across the dock. Marco was standing there, talking to the buyer from the processing plant. He stopped mid-sentence and pointed a thick finger at me. A slow, cruel grin spread across his face. "Look at him," he boomed, making sure everyone could hear. "Chef Dave, graceful as a walrus on roller skates. Bet his biscuits are as clumsy as his feet." The buyer, a man in a clean polo shirt, chuckled politely. The rest of our crew roared with laughter. They laughed as I bent down, my face burning with a shame so hot it felt like it could melt the ice at my feet. I just gathered the spilled ice, my world shrinking to that small, wet patch of wood, the sound of their mockery echoing in my ears. I felt like a boy again, being picked last for a team. Small, useless, and utterly alone. But the real turning point, the moment that set everything in motion, began with a sound. It started about a week ago. It was a tiny thing, almost nothing. A slight metallic cough from deep within the ship's belly, just at the end of the engine's cycle. A little hiccup. No one else seemed to notice. To them, the engine was just a noise, a constant thrumming background to their lives. But to me, it was a voice. It was the language my father taught me. I heard it from my galley, a faint vibration through the floor plates. It was the sound of a problem being born. The first time I mentioned it, I tried to be casual. I was serving one of the deckhands, a kid named Ricky. "Engine sound a little off to you?" I asked quietly. He just shrugged, his mouth full of my jambalaya. "Sounds fine to me, chef. Just leave it to the pros." The pros. That meant Marco and the engineer. That meant not me. I tried to let it go, but the sound was like a splinter in my mind. It got a little worse each day, a cough becoming a rasp. I knew that sound. It was the whisper of metal fatigue, of a part crying out under a strain it wasn't designed to bear. I felt a cold knot tighten in my gut. This wasn't just a mechanical issue, it was a ghost. My father's ghost, standing beside me, urging me to listen. So, 3 days ago, I couldn't stand it anymore. During the mid-afternoon lull, when the crew was napping or mending nets, I went below. The engine room was a roaring, sweltering cathedral of moving steel. The heat hit me like a physical blow. But the noise, the smell of hot oil and diesel, it was strangely like coming home. I didn't touch anything at first. I just stood there, closing my eyes, letting the vibrations travel up through my boots, just like my father had taught me. "Listen to what she's telling you, son." And she was telling me something was wrong with the fuel delivery. A subtle starvation. I saw a wrench lying on a workbench, and on pure instinct I picked it up. My hand knew its weight. I was just going to check the tension on the fuel line bracket. A simple 2-minute check. And that's when his shadow fell over me. If you've ever felt this way, just leave a in the comments. We understand. The silence was the first thing that truly terrified them. One moment, the world was the steady, thrumming heartbeat of the Cajun Queen, a rhythm so constant you forgot it was there. The next, it was gone. The engine didn't sputter or die with a bang. It just stopped, and in its place, a profound, unnatural quiet rushed in. The only sounds left were the slap of water against the hull and the nervous creak of the ship's old bones as it began to wallow in the swell, suddenly just a helpless piece of driftwood 80 miles from anything. Panic smells like sweat and fear. It rose from the deck in a wave. I heard shouting from the bridge, a sharp, ragged edge to the captain's voice. Marco was bellowing orders, his usual bravado stretched thin, cracking under the strain. He was trying to hide his fear with anger, but fear is a hard thing to hide on a small boat. For an hour, I watched from the galley door as he and the engineer, a man named Henderson, wrestled with the dead engine. Their curses echoed in the still air, growing louder and more desperate with each failed attempt to restart it. The radio was just a crackle of static and empty space. We were utterly, terrifyingly alone. I stood there, my hands gripping a dish towel, and I could feel my father's ghost beside me. He wasn't a comforting presence. He was impatient, disappointed, his voice a low grumble in the back of my mind. "Are you just going to stand there, boy? Listen to her. She's telling you what's wrong." And she was. The sudden clean stop wasn't an electrical failure. It wasn't a fuel clog. It was mechanical. It was a break. Something vital had been sheared clean off. I knew it in my bones. I dropped the towel and started walking. Every step I took down the companionway ladder felt like a drumbeat. The crew parted as I approached the engine room hatch, their faces a mixture of desperation and disbelief. They looked at me like I was a madman walking into a fire. Marco was the first to see me. He was slicked with sweat and grease, his face a mask of frustration. "Get out of here, David," he snarled, his voice raw. "We don't have time for you to burn the damn rice." I didn't say a word. I just walked past him, into the suffocating heat of the silent engine room. The air was thick with the stench of hot metal and a faint, acrid smell of burnt wiring from their failed restart attempts. I ignored the tools scattered on the floor. I ignored their stares. I closed my eyes and placed my hand flat against the engine block. It was still hot, but my fingers searched, moving over the cast iron like a blind man reading a familiar face. My father's voice was clear now, guiding me. Feel for the cold spot where the life stopped flowing. The scent was a language I hadn't spoken in 20 years, but my mind translated it instantly. Fuel starvation. But not a blockage, an interruption. I found it, a small patch of metal near the primary injector pump that was just a few degrees cooler than the rest. The heart had stopped pumping. My eyes opened. My voice was steady, cutting through the tense silence. It's the primary injector pump. The shear pin on the drive gear must have snapped. Marco just stared at me, his jaw hanging open. What the hell would you know about an injector pump? He finally managed to stammer. Henderson, the engineer, just looked pale. He knew I was right. I didn't bother to answer Marco. My hands, which they'd only ever seen holding a knife or a spatula, found the tools they were born to hold. A 14mm socket wrench, a flathead screwdriver. They felt like extensions of my own body, of my father's hands, of a past I had tried to bury at sea. The crew had gathered at the hatch, their faces pressed into the opening, watching my every move. The only sounds were the metallic click of the ratchet and the heavy breathing of the men around me. In less than 10 minutes, I had the housing off. I didn't have to look. I pointed with a greasy finger into the guts of the machine. There, I said. See it? The pin's gone. The gear's just spinning free on the shaft. A stunned, heavy silence fell over the engine room. They had been checking fuel lines and fiddling with the electronics, completely missing the simple, catastrophic mechanical failure. There's no spare, Henderson mumbled, his face ashen. We're dead in the water. But my father never trusted spares. He trusted ingenuity. His ghost was smiling now. My eyes scanned the grimy shelves, the forgotten corners of the engine room, and then I saw it. In a rusted coffee can full of old bolts and screws, there was a single hardened steel nail. It was about the right thickness. I grabbed it and then found an old, single-cut file tucked away in a drawer. I sat on an overturned bucket, the greasy nail in one hand, the file in the other, and I began to work. The scrape of metal on metal was the only sound on the entire boat, the only sound for 100 square miles of ocean. Scrap, scrap, scrap. No one spoke. No one moved. They just watched my hands, my soft cook's hands, as I meticulously, patiently filed that nail down, checking it against the empty hole every few minutes. My hands weren't shaking. My focus was absolute. I was shaping our survival from a piece of junk. Finally, I slid it into the gear shaft. It was a perfect, snug fit. I reassembled the housing, my movements economical and sure, tightening the last bolt with a satisfying click. I stood up, wiping my black hands on a rag someone silently held out for me. I looked at the captain, who was watching from the ladder. Try it now. That's when everything changed, and no one ever looked at me the same way again. Would you have done the same? Seriously, just answer with a yes or no, so I know you're here. The starter motor groaned, a sound of metal straining against its own inertia. It caught once, a hopeful cough that sputtered into nothing. A collective breath was held in the thick, oily air. The captain tried again. Another groan, another cough, and then ignition. It wasn't just a sound. It was a physical force, a beautiful, deafening, life-saving roar that shook the very soul of the ship. The deck plates vibrated under my feet. The lights flickered and then held steady, and the dead heart of the Cajun Queen began to beat again. The engine roared to life, and in that moment, every other sound in the world ceased to exist. No one cheered. No one clapped me on the back. The roar of the engine was answered by a profound human silence. It was heavier than the heat, thicker than the diesel fumes. It was the sound of 16 years of naval engineering experience being rendered useless by a cook with a nail. It was the sound of a ship's rigid hierarchy dissolving into thin air. I looked up from the now living machine and saw their faces, illuminated by the single bare bulb swinging overhead. They were masks of disbelief, of awe, and for some, of deep, unsettling shame. Henderson, the engineer, leaned against the bulkhead, his face pale beneath the grime. He wasn't looking at the engine. He was looking at my hands, the hands he'd seen knead dough and chop vegetables, as if seeing them for the first time. His expression was a complex mixture of gratitude and profound professional humility. He, the expert, had been ready to give up. He had pronounced us dead in the water. Then I looked at Marco. He stood frozen, the heavy wrench he'd been using earlier still hanging limply from his hand. The grease on his face couldn't hide the way the blood had drained from it. His jaw was slack, his eyes wide. The usual sneer, the arrogant curl of his lip that had been a constant feature of my life on this boat, was gone, utterly erased. In its place was something raw and naked. It was the look of a man whose entire understanding of the world had just been shattered. He saw the world in simple terms, strong and weak, leaders and followers, men who worked with steel and men who worked with dough. I had just taken his simple world and twisted it into a knot he could never hope to untangle. He looked at me, and for the first time, he didn't see the cook. He saw a man who held a knowledge he couldn't comprehend, a man who had calmly, quietly, and completely dismantled his authority without saying a single word of insult. I didn't say, "I told you so." I didn't offer a smug smile. The roar of the engine was saying everything that needed to be said. I simply bent down, picked up the tools I had used, and wiped each one clean with the rag. My movements were slow, deliberate. I placed the socket wrench back in its designated slot in the toolbox. I returned the old file to the drawer I'd found it in. This wasn't just cleaning up, it was an act of quiet ceremony. This space, the engine room, had been the site of my deepest humiliation. Now it was mine. The air was still hot, still smelled of diesel, but it was different. It was charged with a new kind of power. My power. The other crew members, the kids who had snickered behind Marco's back, were still crammed in the hatchway. Their laughter was a distant memory. They looked from Marco to me and then back again, their faces unreadable but their silence speaking volumes. They were watching a transfer of power, an unspoken shift in the gravitational pull of our small, floating world. The captain's boots appeared on the ladder rungs. He came down slowly, his eyes never leaving me. He was a man of few words, a hardened veteran of the Gulf. But I saw the deep, profound relief in his face. He stopped in front of me, looked at the thrumming engine, then back at me. He just nodded, a single, sharp gesture of respect that was louder than any words of praise. Then he turned to Marco. "Get us underway," he said, his voice flat, all business. But the order wasn't for Marco alone. It was a message for everyone. The crisis was over. The cook had fixed it. As the ship began to shudder, a sign that the propeller was engaging, Marco finally moved. He didn't look at me. He couldn't. He just turned and walked stiffly towards the control panel, his back ramrod straight. The other men dispersed, their whispers starting up as soon as they were out of the engine room, a quiet murmur that would soon spread across the entire vessel. I was alone again with the noise, the heat, and the ghost of my father. I placed my hand on the engine block, feeling the steady, powerful rhythm of my handiwork. "You listened, son," his voice seemed to say in the roar. "You finally listened. I hadn't done it for them. I hadn't done it to prove a point or to earn their respect. I did it because it had to be done. I did it because it was in my blood. Their respect was just an unexpected consequence, a ripple spreading out from a stone I had dropped into the silent water of their ignorance. I was still the cook. I would go back up to my galley and prepare the evening meal. But something had been fundamentally, irrevocably broken and remade in that engine room. And it wasn't just the injector pump. If you've ever proven something to someone in silence, comment, they understood too late. The journey back to Port Fourchon was the quietest trip I'd ever made on the Cajun Queen. The engine, my engine, hummed a steady, reassuring rhythm beneath our feet, a constant reminder of what had happened. But on deck, the usual boisterous noise of the crew was gone. The loud jokes, the shouted commands, the easy camaraderie they had shared at my expense, it had all been replaced by a heavy, thoughtful silence. They worked, mending nets and cleaning the deck, but their movements were subdued, their glances in my direction furtive and uncertain. I was no longer just a fixture of the galley, as much a part of the boat as the stove or the sink. I was an unknown quantity, a problem they couldn't solve. When it was time for the evening meal, I went back to my galley. It was the only thing I knew to do. I chopped onions, seared shrimp, and stirred the roux for a gumbo, my hands moving with the familiar, comforting motions of my trade. But everything felt different. I could feel their eyes on me through the small serving window. When I brought the pot out to the mess table, no one rushed to be first in line. They waited. They actually waited for me to serve myself first, something that had never happened in 2 years. Marco was there, sitting at the head of the table as always, but his usual posture of command was gone. He sat slightly hunched, his eyes fixed on his empty bowl. I ladled a serving for myself and sat down, not at my usual isolated spot at the end of the bench, but right in the middle. No one said a word. The only sound was the clinking of spoons against ceramic. Marco never apologized. I didn't expect him to. Men like him don't know the words. Apology is a language of vulnerability, and his entire world was built on a foundation of unbreachable strength. To admit he was wrong would be to tear that foundation down, brick by brick. But his actions spoke a language I understood perfectly. The next morning, as the sun was just beginning to burn the fog off the water, he found me on the stern, drinking a cup of coffee. He didn't look at me, just stood beside me, staring out at our wake. After a long moment, he cleared his throat. That nail, he said, his voice raspy. How'd you know it would hold? It wasn't an apology, but it was something more. It was a question. He was admitting a gap in his knowledge. He was asking me, the cook, for information. My father taught me, I said simply. He used to say the right piece of junk is better than the wrong spare part. Marco just nodded slowly, taking it in. He finished his coffee in silence and walked away. We never spoke of it again, but from that day on, whenever he walked past me, he met my eyes. It was a small thing, but on a boat where I had been invisible for 2 years, it was everything. The rest of the crew followed his lead. The snickering stopped. The condescending jokes vanished. Young Ricky, the deckhand who'd told me to leave things to the pros, started calling me Mr. E. David. He'd bring me his fishing reel when it got tangled, asking if I could help him fix it. They started talking to me, not just at me. They asked about my life before the Cajun Queen, a topic that had never once come up. I didn't tell them everything. I didn't tell them that after my father died, I ran from his world, from the smell of diesel and the weight of his legacy. I didn't tell them I'd spent 15 years working as a chief engineer on cargo ships, traveling the world, before a personal tragedy made me crave the quiet anonymity of a galley. They didn't need to know the details. They just needed to know that I was more than the man who cooked their meals. They had seen it with their own eyes. The sea has a way of stripping you down to what you are, not what you pretend to be. Out there, 80 miles from shore with a dead engine and a silent radio, titles don't matter. First mate, engineer, deckhand, cook. They're just words. The water doesn't care how loud you can shout or how strong your back is. It only asks one question. When everything goes wrong, what can you do? In that moment of crisis, the hierarchy of the boat didn't just bend, it shattered. And in the silence that followed, a new one was formed, based not on bravado, but on competence. My father knew that. He lived his life by that code. I had spent half my life running from that truth, hiding in the steam of my kitchen, believing that a quieter path meant a weaker one. But my father's ghost, in that hot, silent engine room, had forced me to remember who I was. I hadn't just fixed an engine. I had reclaimed a part of myself I thought I had buried long ago. We docked at Port Fourchon under a gray, overcast sky. As the crew secured the lines, the captain called me up to the bridge. He handed me my pay for the trip, along with a bonus that was more than a month's wages. There's a spot for a second engineer on the Sea Serpent, he said, gesturing to a larger, newer vessel across the dock. It's a better boat, better pay. The job's yours if you want it. I looked from the new ship back to the greasy, rust-streaked hull of the Cajun Queen. I looked at the crew below, watching me from the deck. I saw Marco, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable, but his attention fixed solely on me. I had a choice. I could take the promotion, the respect that came with the title, and leave this all behind, or I could stay. I often wonder about that moment, and about the days that followed. I wonder if the respect they showed me was real, or if it was just the aftershock of fear. Do they remember me for what I did? Or do they just respect me now because they needed me then? It's a question that hangs in the salt air, a ghost that follows our wake. Read this ending and comment with one word that sums you up when they doubted you.